choices, ranging from solid and safe to outright risky and bizarre, used to catch a surprised opponent. The way we open a game of chess largely shapes the type of game that will be played. Will it be a fast paced, aggressive game filled with tactics and attacks, or a slower, strategic game with more positional maneuvering? It's up to you and your opponent. The most popular white opening is e4. You may have heard of the Ruy Lopez, Italian game, and Sicilian defense openings. They all start with the move e4. Now let's take a closer look at the basic ideas behind these e4 openings. Black's most classical defense to e4 is e5, gaining an equal amount of central space. And after the usual knight f3 and knight c6, one of the most classical openings is known as the Italian game, or gioco piano, meaning quiet game. The opening turns into the Italian game after bishop to c4, controlling the center and attacking Black's weak point on f7. Black now has two main options, bishop to c5 or knight to f6. After knight to f6, although this is a sensible developing move, it does allow the complicated knight to g5, joining the bishop on c4 and attacking f7. This leads to very dangerous attacking lines, and Black has to know exactly what to do to avoid getting into a very bad or losing position quickly. For this reason, we recommend playing the more straightforward bishop to c5. Black develops the bishop to an active diagonal, pointing at the weak f2 square. Notice that white cannot play knight to g5 because Black's queen protects that square. So if white plays d3, Black develops the knight with knight to f6. White should continue by castling and focusing on completing development. But if white plays knight to g5, hoping to set up an attack against f7, Black can simply castle, moving the king to safety and adding the rook to the defense of f7. Sometimes white insists on attacking f7 and will play knight takes f7. Although it may look a little scary to expose your king to attack, Black is perfectly fine after rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, and king takes f7. Notice that Black has both knights and a bishop developed, and white has not developed a single piece other than pawns. Even though Black's king looks exposed, it is not easy to attack it. Black will continue to complete development much more quickly than white, and Black can always move the king back to g8 and even h8 if you're really worried about king safety. Now let's take a look at white's most popular response to e5, the Ruy Lopez. After bishop to b5, this opening is known as the Ruy Lopez. White puts pressure on Black's knight that is helping protect the pawn on e5 and control the center. Black's most popular move is a6, attacking white's bishop. White sometimes will capture the knight with bishop takes c6. White gives up the light squared bishop to double Black's pawns on the c-file. This is known as the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez. Black should recapture with d takes c6. White can castle and play against Black's slightly worse pawn structure with the doubled pawns on the c-file. But white should not try to win a pawn after knight takes e5. Black can now play queen to d4, attacking both the knight on e5 and the pawn on e4. After white moves the knight to safety, Black captures the e4 pawn, getting a good game. Since capturing the knight on c6 does not win a pawn, white usually plays bishop to a4, retreating the bishop and keeping pressure on Black's knight. White's general plan is to castle kingside and prepare to attack the e5 square with c3 and d4. Black often plays knight to f6, attacking white's center. White can play the solid d3, protecting the pawn, but white's most popular option is to castle. White ignores Black's attack on e4. If Black attempts to take the pawn with knight takes e4, white temporarily loses a pawn on the e-file, but notice that Black has a knight, pawn, and king all lined up on the open e-file. White's rook can now attack on the e-file with rook e1, attacking Black's knight. If Black's knight retreats, the rook will join the knight on f3 in attacking the e5 pawn, so white will regain that pawn. If black tries to protect the knight, notice that white can simply play d3 on the next turn and force the knight off the e file. Although knight takes e4 is a respectable line if black doesn't try to keep the pawn, black usually decides where to develop the dark squared bishop. Black sometimes plays bishop to c5, bringing the bishop to the active g1 to a7 diagonal. One good plan for white is to play c3, followed by d4, attacking the bishop and gaining a large center. Since the bishop on c5 can become a target of attack, black's most solid option is to play bishop to e7. Black is ready to castle with a solid position. It is very important for black to know what to do after white's most popular response, rook to e1. Once the e4 pawn is protected, white is ready to play bishop takes c6 and win the pawn on e5. Black should prevent this by playing b5, and after bishop to b3, black castles. White will prepare to attack black's center pawn on e5 with c3 and d4. Black usually defends e5 by playing d6 and deciding where to develop the light-squared bishop. This is one of the most well-known positions on the Ruy Lopez. After learning more about the Italian and Ruy Lopez openings, let's test your opening knowledge in the challenges. As you begin to learn the game, the most common response to e4 you'll see is e5, an excellent choice from beginner to grandmaster. Once you gain more experience, you will also see c5. This is known as the Sicilian defense. Black fights for the d4 square immediately. After knight f3, black has several popular moves, including e6, d6, and g6. The Sicilian is such a complicated opening with so many options. We are just going to discuss the basic ideas that both sides can use. Of the many options, knight to c6 is one of the most popular choices. White sometimes plays bishop to b5, but white's most popular and aggressive move is opening up the position with d4. This is known as the open Sicilian. Black will not let white keep two pawns in the center, so black trades a wing or non-center pawn, c5, for white's central d4 pawn with c takes d4. After knight takes d4, white wants to open up the position to attack because white can complete development faster than black. Because remember, black spent time to play c5 on the first move to imbalance the position instead of developing the king side right away with the safer e5. On the other hand, black is happy to trade pawns on d4 because this means black has two pawns, d7 and e7, that can fight for central space, and white has only one central pawn, e4. The Sicilian can be very tactical, where attacks and counterattacks are common. Here are a couple common plans for both sides. Black can attack white's center immediately with e5, or fianchetto the dark square bishop with g6. And after knight c3, bishop g7, black's bishop attacks white's knight on d4. This opening is known as the accelerated dragon. After bishop to e3, protecting the knight and developing a piece, black usually plays knight to f6. White can play positionally by playing bishop to e2 and castling kingside, a common setup for white against almost all Sicilian defenses. Or play the more aggressive bishop to c4, pointing at black's weak f7 square. White may decide to castle queenside and attack black's kingside with moves like f3, g4, and h4, or play more cautiously by castling kingside. Black will always look for a chance to safely play d5, attacking white's center and opening up the light-squared bishop. Another popular choice for black is to play knight f6. And after knight c3, instead of trying to attack white's center immediately, black will sometimes try to keep the center closed with d6. And after bishop c4, play e6, blocking white's light-squared bishop from attacking f7 and preventing any white pieces from entering the d5 square. After bishop to e3, protecting the knight on d4, and bishop to e7, White can safely castle kingside or play queen e2, so that after castles, White sharpens the game with castling queenside. White has ideas such as f3, g4, and h4, attacking the black kingside. And black will try to attack on the queen side with ideas of a6 and b5, or try to open up the center with d5. As you can see, there are a lot of ways to play the Sicilian defense. Now that you've been introduced to the sharp Sicilian defense, let's take it to the challenges. After e4, black often plays the classical defense e5, or the counterattacking Sicilian defense with c5. Both moves put pressure on the d4 square, but black doesn't always play to prevent d4. Another popular way of opening against e4 is by allowing white to get two pawns in the center and then counterattacking white's center. After e6, the opening is known as the French defense. White grabs more space with d4, and black strikes in the center with d5. One common way for white to continue is by playing e5, known as the advanced variation. White advances the pawn and grabs space. Black will fight against white's center with c5, and after c3, white creates a strong pawn chain from b2 to e5. This is a typical position in the French defense. White gains more space in the center and tries to hold on to the space advantage, and black tries to attack and destroy white's center. Defending the e4 pawn and developing a knight is more popular than the advanced variation. The most popular opening is after knight c3, protecting e4 and putting pressure on the d5 square. This allows black to play the sharp bishop to b4, pinning white's knight and threatening to capture the pawn on e4. White's most common reply is e5, gaining space in black's territory. Once again, black counterattacks white's center with c5. The other popular move to defend e4 is knight to d2, known as the Tarrasch opening. This move prevents black from pinning the knight with bishop to b4 because white can play c3. Notice this move does block the bishop on c1 and queen on d1, so development in this opening can be a bit slower than knight to c3. Black continues by attacking white's center, often with the typical French defense counterattack move, c5. Notice one drawback in the French defense is after the move e6, black's bishop on c8 is blocked. We'll now take a look at a similar opening that develops the light-squared bishop before playing e6. After the move c6, this is known as the Caro-Kann opening. It is a solid option to prepare an attack on e4, so it is similar to the French defense. After d4, d5, a popular choice for white is e5. This is very similar to the French defense. The main difference is that black will develop the light-squared bishop before playing e6. Black plays bishop to f5, planning on playing e6 and then c5. Notice that black will move the c-pawn twice in order to attack white's center with c5. This is the trade-off with the French defense. Black's light-squared bishop is more active in the Caro-Kann, but it takes more time to attack white's center with c5. A popular choice for white is knight to c3, developing a piece, protecting the e4 pawn, and attacking the d5 pawn. After d takes e4, knight takes e4. White enjoys more space by having a pawn directly in the center. Black will often attack white's knight with bishop to f5. White typically retreats the knight to g3, moving the knight to safety and gaining a tempo against black's bishop, which will need to move again. Now that you've learned the ideas behind attacking the e4 pawn in the French and Caro-Kann defenses, let's put your knowledge to the test. d4 is white's most popular alternative to e4 games. Although typically not as fast-paced as many e4 openings, d4 is a rich opening move with many positional and attacking ideas. Let's take a look at some of the most common openings after d4. After d4, white is ready to play e4 on the next turn, so black's most solid defense is preventing this idea with d5. White will sometimes play moves like bishop f4, known as the London system, but white's most direct and popular plan is to put pressure on d5 right away with c4. This opening is known as the Queen's Gambit. White wants to remove black's pawn on d5 so that white can play e4 and gain more space in the center. Black's two most popular responses to the Queen's Gambit defend the d5 pawn with either e6 or c6. But sometimes black captures the pawn with d takes c4, known as the Queen's Gambit accepted. Black typically does not get a good position by trying to hold on to the extra pawn on c4, but the main idea behind giving up the center is to open up the d file to place pressure on d4. White will usually take over the center with e4, planning on rapid development and trying to prevent black from comfortably developing. Giving up the center is usually a risky decision, so black more often protects the d5 pawn with one of the next two opening ideas. When black plays c6, this opening is known as the Slav defense. Black protects the d5 pawn, so if white captures on d5, black can recapture with a pawn and still control the center. After knight to f3 and knight to f6, white usually plays knight to c3. Black has a choice to make the opening a Slav or a semi-Slav defense. How do we know which opening is which? The Slav defense is when black develops the light-squared bishop before playing the move e6. The semi-Slav defense is when black keeps the bishop on c8 and plays e6. If black wants to play the Slav defense, which means developing the light-squared bishop before playing e6, black should play d takes c4. If black plays bishop f5 immediately, white has the tricky c takes d5. And after c takes d5, white now plays queen to b3. Notice that white's queen attacks b7 and adds a second attacker to the d5 pawn. Black can play b6, but this weakens light squares in black's territory. Black could retreat the light-squared bishop back to c8, maybe black's best choice, or try queen to b6, protecting the b7 pawn and attacking white's queen. White can win a pawn after knight takes d5. And if black trades queens with queen takes b3, hoping that white will immediately capture the queen and then lose the knight on d5, white has the very nice in-between move, knight to f6 check. And white has won a pawn after all of the trades. This explains why black plays d takes c4 first. Black captures the pawn and is threatening to hold on to the pawn with b5. So white typically plays a4, preventing b5. White is ready to play e4 and take over the center, so black will play bishop to f5, developing the bishop toward the center and protecting the e4 square. This is the main line of the Slav defense. White will often play e3, protecting the d4 pawn and preparing to recapture black's pawn on c4 with the light-squared bishop. Both sides will focus on completing development and castling. If black does not play the Slav defense by developing the light-squared bishop before playing e6, black's other main idea is to play the semi-Slav defense with e6. Black builds a very solid structure in which both e6 and c6 protect the d5 pawn. Black can play solid developing moves aimed at controlling the center, such as knight b to d7 and bishop to d6. White can play the slow but solid e3, adding protection to the center and protecting the c4 pawn, but this move does block the dark squared bishop. Or white can play the more aggressive bishop to g5, pinning black's knight and placing pressure on the center. Black can play the solid bishop to e7, unpinning the knight, or challenge white by playing d takes c4, surrendering the center but trying to keep a pawn after e4 and b5. play becomes incredibly sharp after e5. Attacking the pinned knight on f6, black fights back with h6, counterattacking white's bishop, which is pinning the knight. After bishop to h4, black plays g5, breaking the pin on the f6 knight. Incredible complications follow, where both sides must know exactly what they are doing to avoid entering a bad or losing position. The other popular option to defend the d5 pawn is by playing e6. This is known as the Queen's Gambit declined. Black protects d5 with a pawn, securing black's control of the center. The only drawback is that the light-squared bishop on c8 will have issues developing. After knight to c3 and knight to f6, both sides develop knights toward the center and focus on the d5 and e4 squares. White now has a couple of options. Sometimes white plays knight to f3 and bishop to f4, placing pressure on c7 as well as the queen side in general. The more traditional move is bishop to g5, developing a piece and pinning the knight to the queen. Black plays bishop to e7, unpinning the knight and preparing to castle. One common line of play is e3. White controls the center and prepares to complete kingside development, and after castles, unlike e4, e5 openings, when white's light-squared bishop often moves to c4 to enjoy the open diagonal pointing toward black's castled king, notice in d4, d5 openings, that diagonal is blocked by the d5 pawn. Can you see a more active diagonal for white's light-squared bishop? That's right, the b1 to h7 diagonal. White will plan on developing the bishop to d3, move the knight to f3, and castle. Black, on the other hand, has to decide what to do with the light-squared bishop. A popular plan for black is to play b6, planning to develop the bishop to b7 and protect the pawn on d5 and help control the center. The Queen's Gambit decline is a safety-first opening where black builds a strong center around the d5 square and tries to prevent white from favorably opening up the center with e4. After exploring the main ideas behind d4, d5, let's go to the challenges. After d4, black's most common defense is d5. Let's take a look at some popular alternatives for black. Black does not always play d5. Another way to prevent white's plan of playing e4 on the next turn is knight to f6. White still wants to play c4, controlling more space in the center, e4 playing knight to c3. After e6, white plays knight to c3, threatening to play e4 on the next turn. Black can now play bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king so it cannot support e4. After bishop to b4, this opening is known as the Nimzo-Indian defense. Notice after only 3 moves, black is ready to castle. White often plays e3, preparing to play bishop to d3 and e4. One way for black to continue is with b6, so that after bishop d3, black can play bishop to b7, adding another defender to the e4 square and threatening the unprotected g2 pawn. After knight to f3, both sides typically castle. Now that the knight on c3 is unpinned and can help control the center, black usually plays bishop takes c3. And after b takes c3, black doubles white's pawns on the c-file, but also gives white the 2 bishops. Black will enjoy a positional advantage with the better pawn structure, while white will try to open up the position and attack with the 2 bishops, so both sides have good reasons to look forward to the middle game battle. Another way for white to play against the Nimzo-Indian is with queen to c2, protecting the knight, which prevents black from doubling white's pawns on the c-file. Notice that the queen also supports e4, so one common idea for black is to play d5. Black gains a fair share of the center and makes it difficult for white to safely play the move e4. Play can be similar to the Queen's Gambit decline. Sometimes, black does not prevent white from gaining more space in the center with e4. After g6, Black fiend shadows the bishop to g7 and plans on counterattacking white's large center. After knight to c3 and bishop to g7, this opening is known as the King's Indian defense. Black builds up a solid defense for black's king once it castles kingside, and notice that the bishop on g7 is already pointing at the d4 square. Black will aim to attack this pawn, as we will see. After e4 and d6, black prevents white from gaining too much space with e5, and also prepares to play e5 once black castles. After knight to f3, castles, and bishop to e2, black can play knight b to d7, preparing to play e5. After white castles, black strikes in the center with e5. This is black's main counterattacking strategy in the King's Indian. Black is ready to capture on d4, which will strengthen the dark-squared bishop's ability to attack on that diagonal. If white grabs more space with the typical d5, notice that once the pawn on d4 moves, the c5 square is no longer protected. Black can take advantage of the space left behind with knight to c5, joining the other knight in attacking e4. After queen to c2, developing the queen and protecting e4, we can see the main ideas of the King's Indian. White has more space and will try to grab more queenside space with b4. Black often will try to slow white down by playing a5, but black's main idea is to attack white's center with c6, and once the knight moves from f6, play f5, attacking the e4 square and setting up a kingside attack. Another opening similar to the King's Indian in allowing white to play e4 is the Gruenfeld defense. The Gruenfeld starts after black plays d5, attacking white's c4 pawn and allowing white to take over the center with c takes d5, knight takes d5, and e4. Why does black allow white to take over the center so easily? Like the Nimzo Indian, black is going to create a pawn weakness after knight takes c3 and b takes c3. Although the c3 pawn protects d4, it is also a weakness because it can only be defended by pieces and not pawns. This will become a target for black. After bishop to g7, black's bishop lines up with the d4 and c3 pawns on the long dark square diagonal. After knight to f3, black plays c5, the key Gruenfeld move. Black allows white to gain a strong center in order to attack it. Notice white cannot take the c5 pawn because then black would play bishop takes c3, regaining the pawn and forking the king and rook. The plans for both sides in the Gruenfeld are clear. White will defend the center and at some point push the central pawns up the board, trying to create a passed pawn. Black will continue to place pressure on white's center, especially the d4 square. Gruenfeld games can often be very tactical, where one false step can end the game quickly. One more opening that is seen from time to time is the risky Dutch defense. Black plays f5, controlling the e4 square. This opening is considered very risky because it does not develop a piece and opens up black's king on the e8 to h5 diagonal. Black hopes to gain a kingside attack and is willing to risk king's safety in order to attack. A simple way to handle the position for white is to play g3. In the Queen's Gambit, we mentioned white's light-squared bishop usually develops to the d3 square to enjoy the open diagonal. Notice that f5 blocks white's bishop if it tries to move to the d3 square, so white will often place the bishop on the long light-squared diagonal, h1 to a8. After knight f6 and bishop to g2, white will simply castle kingside when black's weakened king position may cause trouble in the middle game for black. Now that you've learned many of the common d4 openings, it's time to test your knowledge. One of the most exciting, as well as dangerous opening strategies are gambits. The gambit player often sacrifices one or two pawns, or even at times an entire piece, to rip open lines and try to gain a huge lead in development to overwhelm the opponent with an irresistible attack. A gambit is like a gamble. If it works, the gambit player often wins quickly. But if the gambit fails and the defense holds, the gambit player can simply have a bad position and even enter a losing endgame where the missing material decides the game. Let's take a look at some examples of gambit play. After e4, e5, and f4, this opening is known as the king's gambit. White gambits the f-pawn, allowing e takes f4, in order to gain more central control with d4. White also hopes to take advantage of not having a white pawn on the f-file to use that file to attack with rooks and a queen later in the game. The king's gambit is risky, not only because it sacrifices a pawn, but it also opens up white's king to possible attack on the e1 to h4 diagonal. After accepting the gambit pawn, black is already threatening queen h4 check, so white typically plays knight to f3, developing a piece and protecting the h4 square from attack. White's goal is to develop quickly and set up an attack before black can complete development. If white succeeds, white will often win with quick attacks. If white is unable to break through black's position, black will often be up material, have a safer king, and enjoy a better position. Another gambit for white that sacrifices even more material is known as the Danish gambit. It begins after d4. After e takes d4, white offers another pawn with c3. After d takes c3, white develops with bishop c4, offering another pawn. After c takes b2 and bishop b2, white has sacrificed two pawns to open the long dark squared diagonal a1 to h8. And white now has two bishops already developed and pointing toward black's kingside. White's pawn on e4 also controls good central space, so black must be careful as black does not have any pieces developed. As black is so far behind in development, one popular plan is to return at least one of the gambit pawns with d5. This opens up black's light-squared bishop, and it also attracts white's bishop to d5, where it will later be attacked by knight f6. This will help black catch up in development. It's important to remember that when you play against a gambit and accept material, one effective strategy is to return some of the material to catch up in development and slow down your opponent's attack. Since e takes d5 would block the light-squared bishop's attack on black's weak f7 square, and queen takes d5 would offer a trade of queens, usually not a good way to continue in attack, white usually plays bishop takes d5. And after knight f6, black's first piece is developed. Notice that black's king is overworked. It is protecting both the f7 square and the queen on d8. White has the nice deflection tactic, bishop takes f7 check. This is why gambit play can be so dangerous. When your opponent gains a lead in development, these tactics often appear. It turns out, however, that black has not blundered, because black has a clever trick prepared after king takes f7 and queen takes d8. Black loses a queen for the moment, but notice that the white queen is lined up with black's bishop and rook. Can you find a discovered attack that regains the queen for black? That's right. After bishop b4 check, black's bishop checks the king and reveals the rook's attack on white's queen. White's best move is to play queen to d2, gaining more material before the doomed queen leaves the board. After bishop takes d2 check, knight takes d2, and rook e8. The wild gambit play has settled down, where both sides have equal material in this queenless middle game. Not all opening gambits are played by white. After the moves d4, knight f6, and c4, black can play the Budapest gambit with the move e5. This move opens up lines for the dark-squared bishop and queen, and also attacks white's center. If white wants to fight for an opening advantage, white should accept the Budapest gambit with d takes e5, accepting the gambit and attacking black's knight. Black now focuses on attacking the e5 pawn, starting with knight to g4. After bishop f4, knight c6, and knight f3, both sides have been developing pieces to fight for the e5 square. After bishop to b4 check, white can play knight to c3, letting black capture the knight and double white's pawns, or play knight b to d2. This is a solid move for white, but white must be on the alert for one deadly tactical trick that black will try. After queen to e7, black adds a third attacker to e5 and also lines up with white's king on the e-file. A simple way to play for white is to play e3, bishop e2, and castle kingside, returning black's gambit pawn on e5. Like most other gambit lines that black can play, white should have the better chances by developing sensibly and staying alert for tricks. But sometimes white plays a3, trying to unpin the knight on d2. Black now has the surprising knight g takes e5, completely ignoring white's threat. White will still be just fine after knight takes e5 and playing e3. But if white insists on capturing black's bishop with a takes b4, black can now win the game in one move. Can you see how? That's right, with the smothered mate, knight to d3 check. The pawn on e2 is pinned, and the king is smothered by its own pieces. You've now learned some typical gambit openings and ideas, so now it's your turn to test out your gambit knowledge. One of the worst feelings in chess is when you fall for an opening trap that your opponent has prepared before the game. You find yourself in a bad or even losing position before you have time to get your pieces developed and start playing chess. Let's take a look at some of the most common opening traps you can use to gain a quick advantage against unprepared opponents, as well as learn how to avoid falling into traps yourself. Sometimes a player decides to defend by copying the opponent's moves. The player thinks if a move is good enough for one side, it should be good enough for the other side. Is that true? Let's take a look. After e4, e5, knight f3, and knight f6, white plays knight takes e5. Both sides have been playing the same moves. Now if black plays d6 before capturing the pawn on e4, this is known as the main line of the Petrov defense, or Russian game, with a solid position for black. If black is only copying, then black will jump into the center immediately with knight takes e4. Black is now in trouble as the e-file has been cleared of pawns, so white can play queen to e2, attacking black's knight. The copycat strategy fails after queen e7 and queen takes e4. Unless black wants to take the copying strategy to the extreme and lose a queen after queen takes e5, black's only way to stay in the game is to play d6, attacking white's knight, which is pinned to the queen. White can simply play d4, and after d takes e5 and d takes e5, white is simply up a pawn with a better position. If black tries to avoid going down a pawn, black may try d5, protecting the knight. After d3, black is on the edge of disaster. If black retreats the knight, say with knight f6, white can win black's queen by force. Can you see how? That's right, with knight to c6, discovering the queen's check against black's king and attacking the black queen. Notice that if the black queen tries to block the check with queen e7, white still wins the queen with knight takes e7. After d3, black's best try is queen to e7, counterattacking white's knight. After d takes e4 and queen takes e5, white still wins a pawn after e takes d5. Notice that black's queen cannot capture the pawn on d5 because it is pinned to the king. This is why copying your opponent is not a good idea. Let's take a look at another opening trap. After e4, c6, black plays the Caro-Kann defense. And after the typical moves d4, d5, knight to c3, and d takes e4. White recaptures, knight takes e4, and black plays knight to d7. Black's idea is to support knight g to f6, so that if white tries to capture that knight, black is prepared to recapture with another knight. White plays the strange-looking queen e2. This is not a great move, as it blocks in the light-squared bishop, but it does set up a deadly trap. If black develops without understanding the point behind white's last move and plays knight g to f6, white can actually win the game in one move. Do you see it? That's right, knight to d6. It's a smothered mate. White's queen is pinning the pawn to the king, and all of black's pieces smother the black king so it cannot escape. What should black have done instead? Black can simply play e6, opening up the dark squared bishop and preventing any chance of a smothered mate. Now white's queen on e2 looks misplaced, which is why opening traps that only hope your opponent doesn't find the best move should not be played. One thing to remember is to only play an opening trap when it improves your position, even if your opponent doesn't fall for the trap. Otherwise, you're just playing hope chess. Let's take a look at a trap in the queen's gambit decline. After d4, d5, c4, and e6, the queen's gambit declined after the typical moves knight to c3, knight to f6, and bishop to g5. White pins black's knight. Black usually plays bishop to e7 in order to unpin the knight, but sometimes black plays the tricky knight b to d7, setting up a trap. Notice that the black queen is no longer protecting d5 now that there's a knight in the way, so white thinks a pawn can be won by taking advantage of black's pin knight on f6. After c takes d5, e takes d5. White should now play e3 or knight to f3. But it looks like white can just win a pawn with knight takes d5, because the f6 knight looks like it's pinned to the queen. Well, it is pinned to the queen, but that doesn't stop black from playing the surprising knight takes d5. After bishop takes d8, notice that white's king only has one square available, d2. Do you see black's idea? That's right, after bishop b4 check, white is forced to block the check with the queen. Forced to block the check with the queen. And after bishop takes d2 and king takes d2, black plays king takes d8. Notice that black has won a knight for a pawn. In the queen's gambit, it's important to know that it's not really a gambit being an opening in which one side sacrifices a pawn or more material for an attack. Because after d takes c4, although the most aggressive move is e4, grabbing more space in the center and threatening to recapture the pawn on c4, sometimes white prefers e3. Black's best idea is to focus on developing the kingside pieces and castling. Sometimes, black is tempted to hold on to the c4 pawn with b5. Black is in for a surprise. After a4, white attacks the defender of the c4 pawn, b5. And after c6, white can play a takes b5. And after c takes b5, notice that now that the pawn is no longer on c6, the h1 to a8 diagonal has been opened. Can you find a way for white to take advantage of these weak light squares and win a piece? That's right, queen to f3. White threatens to win the rook on a8. Black's best defense is to give up a knight for free after knight c6. So after queen takes c6 check, black can play bishop to d7, attacking the white queen and revealing the black queen's protection of the a8 rook. White is up an entire piece, so this shows the risk of trying to hold on to the c4 pawn in the queen's gambit. Now it's your turn to practice setting up, as well as avoiding opening traps.